the very roots of healing, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here.
Welcome to this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour with Cooper Cherry and Taylor Atkins, as always sponsored by the People's Institute for Revolutionary Semiotics. Before we introduce our guest today, we just want to mention we do have a Patreon account at patreon.com/MUHH. Consider tossing us $1 a month there. But today, Taylor and I are happy to have Henry Summers Hall returning to the show. Henry is a reader in the Department of Politics and International Relations and Philosophy at Royal Holloway University of London. He is co-translator of Solomon Maimon's essay on transcendental philosophy, the co-editor of A Thousand Plateaus in Philosophy, and the author of Hegel, Deleuze, and the Critique of Representation, Deleuze's Difference in Repetition, and Edinburgh Philosophical Guide. And I think the last thing that you had published that I'm aware of would be The Judgment and Sense in Modern French Philosophy, a new reading of six thinkers. Henry, we're very happy to have you back on. We should have had you on sooner. I looked it back. It was August of 2022 rather. Oh no, it's been a bit too long, but welcome back.
It's great to be back. Thank you for inviting me. I really enjoyed coming on last time, so it's a real pleasure to come back.
Yeah, and I was telling Coop that we got a lot of really nice feedback about our episode with you. It was well received. That's always nice. Sometimes I feel like we'll do a good episode and we may not get any feedback. That doesn't necessarily mean there wasn't a reaction, just that it's not shared. Encouraging all the listeners out there, leave us some comments too. We like that as well. But I did want to let you know that it was well received, and it's always nice to get that feedback. And so I wanted to share that with you.
I'm really pleased. Like I say, I really enjoyed it. It's sort of, we sort of do all this stuff that's like kind of in the trenches, a bit like today, really. You kind of go through and you're doing like bits of chapters and stuff, and then it's quite nice to sort of have to think about how it all fits together a bit and sort of stand back. So it's actually been really useful just reading back over this stuff to talk about it today.
When you were on the first time, you had mentioned you were writing this book. Is that correct? I think.
Yeah, it's been a few years, I think, off and on. I mean, obviously it's, I'm writing around teaching and things like that, so
right.
It takes a while, but I'm halfway through now. I finished Plateaus 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then 12, 13, and 14. I mean, I have to go back through and tie them all together, but halfway through at the present. Hopefully by the end of next year, this will be finished.
Some of those chapters in the middle are a little bit shorter, right? I mean, I'm thinking of How Does One Make Himself a Body Without Organs is a little bit shorter. Three Novellas is a little bit shorter. Faciality is not, at least not compared to some of the longer chapters, right? So if you've knocked out 3, 10, 11, 12, those are some of the longer ones.
Still got 10 and 11.
You still have to do 10. Okay, well, that's one of the longest. All right, well, okay. Just to let the reader know, in case, since we didn't say, last time we had you on, you had mentioned you're writing a book on A Thousand Plateaus, going chapter by chapter. And so this is what we're talking about today with you, Henry. Again, just to clue the readers in, we decided to focus on the 12th chapter or the 12th plateau. I guess we can call them plateaus or chapters. It works. I like to think that the notion of a plateau is not necessarily merely reducible to the quote unquote chapters in A Thousand Plateaus, right? It's a much more general concept, which am I remembering correctly, they derive from Bateson. At least they say they derive it from Bateson, right? It's a rise in intensity in a sort of conflict or situation, be it political, social, whatnot, that doesn't necessarily have what we might think of as a standard trajectory of a rise and a fall with a beginning and an end, but it doesn't necessarily get resolved in a simple way, but the level is kind of left at a certain pitch. I know that Gregory Bateson works through this. He's got a nice little chapter on it about how this is a part of like mediating conflict in, I forget which societies he's looking at. Anyway, Henry, jump in if you can help me like finish this thought.
I can't remember either. Was it Polynesian societies?
And they may have had a specific name that's failing me. So if it comes to me later, the Balinese, the Bali, is that what it is? Maybe. Anyway, doesn't matter. But I kind of roughly am describing this. And I think it may then generalize the fact that the chapters, to a certain extent, in A Thousand Plateaus don't necessarily have a beginning, middle, and end. They are all rhizomatic, intermezzo, right? They're all sort of in resonance with one another. And so even if there may be a salient theme for each one, a lot of concepts and ideas and topics we will see recur in ways that sometimes can be frustrating when you want to try to pin down, like, okay, here is the definition, the designation of this one term. It's not necessarily the whole story. It could be just a particular aspect that's being highlighted at one time, right?
Well, that's what's been interesting about writing this book, and particularly not necessarily writing it in the order of the plateaus in A Thousand Plateaus, because I started with these. I started with the War Machine. Well, I did the rhizome and then the War Machine. And so, I wasn't really clear, for instance, what an assemblage is. It's like a really key concept. But it's interesting how, like reading it through, these plateaus at the end, sort of 12, 13, 14, the Nomadology and the apparatus of capture, and then smooth and striated spaces, they do form a series in a way, because they've got the propositions, and you go through and you finish the Nomadology with proposition 9, and then I think you start apparatus 10, so you have that continuity. But I completely agree. It's quite a strange book in that sense. I'm sure we'll talk about this in lots of different ways, but you mentioned we might talk about the Go chess analogy, or not analogy, but the Go chess comparison. And I've just been looking at the postulates of linguistics, for instance. And there, that same comparison is played out in terms of Chomsky and Labov. The same structure is operating there in terms of a very, very different field. And as you go through and look at more and more plateaus, what I think you find is that there's a kind of a resonance between them, such that each kind of enriches the other in a way that sometimes it just makes something explicit, but other times there's just a kind of a deepening that's quite difficult to really put your finger on. But it's a very complex structure.
I think that the Go chess, and I don't mind saying analogy. I know that analogy has its own baggage in Deleuze, specifically difference of repetition. But if we use it loosely, the way of playing out the idea of smooth and striated space, for example, in Go and chess, I think that that's a fairly well-known example for readers of A Thousand Plateaus, that at least you see it recur, because I think it's particularly clear as a very helpful image. Maybe that's another word we could use. It's something immediate. Maybe not everyone's played Go, and that's fair. But I think most people are, even if you don't know necessarily the rules and haven't played a lot of chess, you can kind of very quickly understand the differences. You reiterate the example, which I think it's good to keep that in mind. Because obviously striated and smooth space become a lot more intricate. As we know, for the most part, we're not going to have a limit case of a pure example of a smooth or striated space. At least in A Thousand Plateaus, with most of these seeming oppositions, we're going to have these mixtures. But at the very least, it's good to start with this notion. And again, I'll start with chess, and if you want, you can talk a little bit about Go. I don't know if you or Coop have played Go. I've only thought about the rules of it. You played Go?
I have a board, and
okay.
I did play a few times online, but by no means an expert.
Right.
It's really hard, isn't it?
I do find it very intriguing. I think that movie Pi is what got me interested in it.
Right. And so in chess, as we all know, the board is laid out. There's 64 squares as an 8x8, something like that. I'm trying to remember, but each piece has a defined role, so we can only make certain moves. It's sort of a linear progression. There's only so much you can do in one turn, right? You can only capture one piece at most in one turn. A lot of times you're not even doing that. You're really trying to occupy a space that's already gridded based on the figures. But Go seems to be a lot more complex and seems to go into, I suppose, another way that they talk about smooth space sometimes. And I could be wrong here, so correct me if I'm wrong, Henry. Is nomadic distribution supposed to be another way of speaking of smooth space, or is it more complex than that?
Yes, I think so.
Should I not conflate distribution with space? Maybe they mean that there would be a difference between distribution and space. So maybe that would be the thing. But perhaps smooth space is something like a nomadic space.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I think that's right. I think this is really the problem at the heart of the whole book, in a way. Striated space, the notion of chess, what you have in chess is you have like a set of rules that are fixed rules and fixed meanings to pieces, and then you move them around in various ways. And what that means is, in a sense, the form pre-exists the particular instantiation. It's all there in advance in that the pieces have a meaning. You find this in lots of other cases that they're looking at. Chomskyan linguistics is the same thing. You have very basic meanings, and then you have rules that allow you to combine these meanings in particular ways and to form, sentences. So just as in a game of chess, there's a kind of almost an infinite number of games possible from a finite number of elements that are constants and then a set of rules. You find the same thing in linguistics, in Chomskyan linguistics. You have a finite set of elements, you have a certain set of rules of combination, and that gives you all of the stuff.
A finite competence and infinite performance, something like this, right? Am I?
Yeah.
I'm trying to use Chomsky's terms here, right?
Yeah, so like performance is going to be finite because there's only you can't actually make a sentence that goes on forever. But the kind of the competence there is going to be there where you can construct an infinite number of sentences. But what that relies on in both cases is that you have a whole set of rules that, in a sense, pre-exist the playing out of that stuff in the world. And I think we might get on to Kleist later on, but something very similar happens when Hegel's critical of Kleist. Hegel says, well, Kleist, they think he's like Shakespeare, but he's not, because the people in Kleist's plays have no character. And
by character, he means interiority, something like that. I think that becomes synonymous in the language that you use, and perhaps what Deleuze and Guattari are thinking about.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a kind of moment of interiority, but it's like kind of, you can see it as character as like a moment before the play, almost outside of the time of the play.
I see.
Aristotelian, where there's a character that these figures have, and then the play is just the unfolding of this character in a particular situation. So you find the same thing there, where there's a form that pre-exists what happens. And in all these cases, obviously, we find like problems. So as Labov notes, when we're using language, for instance, we invent new forms of language. We kind of say things that haven't been said before. That doesn't really make sense in Chomsky's world, because Chomsky relies on the fact that we're all using the same rules. So there's no value to us starting to say things that are slightly different, because the ability to communicate is going to get worse, and so the value of that language suffers. So variation becomes very, very difficult. So what you find happening is this claim that the form is there, it's expressed in time, and imperfections are kind of like a form of noise. It doesn't work properly, it's just a form of noise. But to get back to chess, so that's the model of chess, where you have all of the stuff is kind of before the game, and then the game is just the playing out in the time of the game of the stuff that exists before. Whereas Go is something, for Deleuze and Guattari, that's much more, where there's a kind of creation of a space, rather than the playing out within a space. As you put the pieces down and you're kind of trying to control territory on the Go board, there's sort of the way the space is organized changes. Now, I mean, obviously you're still putting pieces onto a Euclidean board, onto a homogeneous board there, but they see it as a kind of, the thinking behind it as being a lot more like a Riemannian space, like a space where as you put the pieces down, the structure of the space itself changes. So you no longer have this sharp divide between kind of constants and variables for them that you find in the kind of chess model. Fixed space, pieces just moving through that space according to constant rules.
There's a phrase that they steal from, I say steal, I mean that in a positive way, not in a negative way, right? They reprise from Virilio, a fleet in being. where they're describing maritime warfare and the way of sort of occupying, the surface of the water, which also gets mirrored in air warfare, right? And so maintaining a fleet and being seems to be also perhaps applicable to how one strategizes and go in terms of occupying a space.
That makes sense to me. I don't have much to say about that, but
No. I'm just trying to. I wanted to say. The phrase "fleet and being" because I think it's a pretty cool phrase.
Yeah.
So if we don't even unpack it more, shout out to Virilio, who seems to be, especially in the footnotes, not just in the footnotes, also in the body of the text, even in this chapter. But Virilio seems to give them a lot of food for thought, and so it's great to unpack some of that. And Coop and I, what was it, about 6 months ago, we did Virilio's book on
War and
cinema, and that was a lot of fun, and you can see some of the resonances, and it kind of tracks with a lot of the content of this chapter because it is kind of looking in his own way at, let's say, the Machinic phylum and it's the development of technology and its relation to war. Obviously, really is using his own categories, and I guess I would also like to circle back. Last time we had you on, you told a very nice story about your philosophical origin story, and I guess I would just want to see if you had anything to add in terms of tackling A Thousand Plateaus, in terms of your trajectory, where A Thousand Plateaus in particular drew you in to make you want to write about this book in particular. It's obviously a fruitful work that could be unpacked for, well, we could say 1,000 years, right? But how did that strike you, that desire to tackle this project?
Well, I think it's to be honest, I finished my last book, and I was planning on writing a book on Sartre.
Okay.
And I still am.
Yeah.
But I kind of felt that I needed to have more time to really think through what I was going to do there. And I sort of felt like, I'd always worked on the early work, and I've not really understood what's going on in A Thousand Plateaus very well. And, you read people like Zizek and Badiou, who are very, very dismissive of this later work. They sort of see it as the work that made Deleuze famous in the American literature department, but it itself lacks any substance. So I just thought it'd be a kind of nice sort of quick project to take on.
A quick project, yeah.
Other projects to just go through and write a book on A Thousand Plateaus.
Okay.
But as was obviously the case, it's like a really long, complicated text.
Yeah.
And so it's sort of dominated what I've been doing for the past couple of years, really. But I think it's a fantastic book, and in many ways, I think Deleuze is obviously political in his earlier work. But I don't think there's a particularly mature notion of what political engagement would be. And I think you start to see it coming through in A Thousand Plateaus. I think particularly in this plateau, where you have different notions of organization, and you have this idea that states kind of rely on this kind of nomadic moment of organization too. You start to see that there's a politics there that's quite valuable. Looking forward as well, I'm kind of aware that there are some connections here that I haven't quite worked out how to draw out between the nomadic and the sedentary, and between the state and the nomad, and what Sartre is doing in his later work between the sort of serialization, which is very close to axiomatics in some way, this kind of majoritarian thinking, and what he calls the group infusion. My suspicion is that in the background of this text is an attempt to try and think this notion of the group infusion that Sartre has in a way that makes it work. Because, for Sartre, there are these moments where real human connections are possible, but they only occur in moments really of revolution, where the state breaks down. What Deleuze and Guattari are doing here, I think, is trying to think that Sartrean notion, particularly in the War Machine Plateau, in a way that gives it some kind of more positive determination.
Interesting.
And you see it all the way through in the school of bridges and roads, and the the street children of Bogota, and there are all these attempts to give at least sort of at least some kind of like non-transient account of what this kind of non-state way of being in a group would be. So that was a bit rambling.
No, I see. It sort of, you started to go on a journey from the Sartre book, but you made clear one of the threads, at least, that drew you towards A Thousand Plateaus, because as you point out in the chapter you share with us, but also as we can see in this Nomadology chapter in particular, Deleuze not only is reworking and further refining concepts that he had developed in Difference of Repetition with the critique of the image of thought, and what he calls in this book, I'm not sure, I don't think he had used the term in Difference of Repetition, but this notion of a noology, as opposed to the study of an image as a thought, as opposed to ideology, which I think on the very second, which is like the second page of the book in Rhizome, they kind of say there is no ideology and never has been, which continues some of the ideas and further some of the ideas from Anti-Oedipus, which makes sense because obviously it's supposedly 2 volumes, right, of a larger. Sometimes we forget capitalism and schizophrenia, or it's easy to forget that there is supposedly a connection. And so, I mean, you can see it in a lot of places, one of which I think is in terms of serialization and group infusion. I always had read Deleuze and Guattari as modeling the notions of subjugated groups and subject groups based on this Sartrean distinction, taking it in their own context. But you can also see like stuff on the nomad. You can see that very clearly in Anti-Oedipus, specifically like I think it's in one of the sections on the Urstadt or around there, where they're talking about these religious sects becoming nomadic and all of this, and they don't fully develop that notion, but they already are kind of thinking of something that they'll become salient in the discussion of like the Crusades, early Islam, etc. And we can also see, obviously, that, as you point out again in the chapter, a notion like nomadic distribution we find in Difference of Repetition. It is interesting to see at least a line going from DNR to ATP, kind of deepening some of and perhaps making more explicit the political implications of something like the critique of the image of thought. And I think that Guattari is one of those, which is why I think Guattari is so fruitful in helping Deleuze to till some of that soil and make more explicit what, if not implicit, is not as emphasized in Deleuze's earlier solo works.
No, I think that's right. I mean, I don't know Guattari well enough, and that's a project for later this year, but there's very much a difference in tone. And I think you're right. It's the same project in many ways. And I think those categories that you brought in, the nomadic distribution and the sedentary distribution, are really, really key to this text, all the way through this question of whether we're kind of surrounded by stuff that's kind of, some of it's relatively stable and some of it's moving around, and that's the way the world is. And the question about whether essentially we've got static frameworks that are kind of somehow pushed into time, and then there's a kind of a noisy process whereby there's a kind of imperfection added by their temporalization, which is the kind of sedentary distribution, right? The idea that there's, for instance, an archetype of what an organism is, and then when it's actualized in time, maybe the actualization isn't perfect, so we get like a slightly less ideal form. And then this idea of the nomadic, which is the idea that time, in a sense, organizes itself into things that look like structure. So there's a process where intensity organizes itself into what kind of appear to be structured elements. I mean, they're not perfectly structured, that's an idealization, but the strata that one finds in the that's my fault.
Nope.
The strata that one finds in the geology of morals, for instance, they're a kind of emergence from a field of intensity. And something similar is going on here. The attempt to understand how state structures emerge without relying on the state already being there structurally before it kind of emerges into time, although that's complicated by the image of thought. And it's
complicated by the Urstadt, right? It is an interesting hypothesis, which, the further back archaeologists dig, it's like they keep uncovering more and more, empires and whatnot, which is what makes them remain allied to Pierre Closter and the critique of evolutionism, right? As though we kind of start with, a state of nature where there isn't any power, and that's really just not yet a development of the harnessing of the forces of what the state will bring in its hierarchization and division of labor, et cetera, as though there is a natural evolution going on. And it is, I suppose he had passed away just a few years before A Thousand Plateaus, because after Anti-Oedipus was published, if you look in the Chaosophy edition, which is under Guattari's name, but it's like a round table at which Pierre Closter is participating, and I think he gives one long response, but he's very complimentary to the work done in chapter 3 of Anti-Oedipus about savages, barbarians, civilized men, whatever, and specifically this, he's kind of fascinated with the fact that what is this critique of psychoanalysis doing in spending the longest chapter devoted to ethnology, right? Ethnography. What is going on here? And he gives them some credit for making explicit some things that may have still been presumably in debate in anthropology, one of which is this notion of exchange not being primary, which we talked about a couple weeks ago, Coop, right, with Derrida. But in any case, we can try not to refer to volume 1 of Capitalist Schizophrenia for now. I did want to give the chance to discuss one thing that I found fascinating. It makes sense that you wrote the chapter on rhizome before this, because you do refer back to that chapter, which you didn't share with us, but which makes sense that the other chapters after rhizome would refer back to some of the work that you had done in that preliminary chapter. And one of the things that I thought was interesting, and I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit about it, was your use of the notion of a swarm of mosquitoes as articulating the notion of the rhizome. And we could obviously talk about a few of the aspects of it. One of the last of which in your chapter that I remember is, not the need for an extra organizational dimension, right? It's kind of the army without a general notion that they use in that chapter. And I always just think of N-1. You subtract the one or the transcendent dimension from rhizomatic multiplicity. But do you want to say anything about this notion of the swarm of mosquitoes, if that was arbitrary, or how that example came to you, or if, just anything at all you'd like to share on that front?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's their example. So
I had forgotten that.
So
okay.
It comes from them. But it comes from a piece by, is it Rosenstahl and Petitot that they refer to?
The mathematicians.
It's their analysis of organization, and they provide, I think it's them anyway. Yeah. They talk about hierarchical structures, and when you have a hierarchical structure of organization, then this becomes really key in the War Machine too. You invariably have several features, like you have roles in the hierarchy, like in a military hierarchy, and you have people occupying those roles, and then you have lines of communication established beforehand. The kind of obvious thing, there are kind of chains of command, and then also, communication goes up and down along these hierarchies. You don't ask the soldier next to you what you should do. He's kind of commanded by someone above, and so are you. So there's a whole structure there already. That's fine, but invariably, therefore, you, as well as the individuals, you have this kind of extra dimension of organization that's kind of overlaid on top to make it work. There's all sorts of technical things around Euclidean geometry around there too. But the mosquito case they bring in because it's a case where, you've got these mosquitoes flying around, and, they're just sort of flying around in random patterns. And it's a bit like pieces on a Go board as well, right? They're just kind of there. And they just follow a really simple rule where they've got their visual field there in front of them. And if they're kind of like, if most of their visual field is mosquito free, then they like fly back in, because it means that they're on the edge of the field, right?
Okay.
Most of it's free, so it's like they're kind of already facing away. So they fly back towards the mosquitoes, And that's the only rule they follow. And with that one rule, the mosquito swarm kind of maintains a system of organization.
Interesting.
Maintains the structure. And it's a sort of structure that's kind of stable, quasi-stable, but yet defined by the kind of the interaction of the elements themselves. This ties in really with the notion of nomad science. I don't know if you want to go there. Should we go there now?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to. I would, because we got a chance on Friday to talk with Thomas Nail, and I had already anticipated some of the stuff that he was talking about in his kinetic materialism. I had said, this sounds a lot like nomad minor science versus royal science. And we didn't really dive into that because he didn't write about it, but I was already anticipating this conversation. So yes, please.
Okay, yeah, no, great. I mean, I was curious as to whether you'd go through this stuff. I mean, he's done so much stuff.
Right, yeah, he's prolific. But yes, I've always been fascinated by this opposition, and I like that you put a lot of emphasis on Michel Serres, The Birth of Physics. That was a book that Cooper and I covered a few weeks after we had you. I think, well, maybe a few months after we had you on, but we got to go into a little bit about turbulence, but we didn't really discuss all of how much they really do rely on Serres in this plateau for this proposition, Yeah,
it's really key. I think it's key to much of the project. I mean, there are all sorts of other references. I think the difficulty always with Deleuze and Guattari too is you can work this stuff through in terms of Michel Serres, but Bergson's there doing very, very similar things.
Right.
But to stick to the Serres, Serres talks about Lucretius and this notion of Lucretius where, you've got matter falling down, just coming straight down vertically. And then there's the clinamen, there's a kind of slight deviation, and it causes things to bump into each other. And that's how the world comes into being. That's obviously one of those quaint models that you get, you sort of read it in first year philosophy class, and it's interesting, but it's like, isn't it funny what people used to think back then? There's that kind of model, which is the kind of the logic of solid bodies. But what Serres argues, and Deleuze and Guattari take him up on this, is that it's much better understood in terms of flows. So if you think about a kind of a laminar flow, that's a flow where, all of the elements in the flow are kind of moving parallel to each other in the same direction, then what Serres takes Lucretius to be saying is that, that's the model where you have this flow. And then you have a slight moment of turbulence. And that slight moment of turbulence disrupts the flow. And it's the disruption that causes structure. What structure in that case? Well, structure is more like not things, not collections of stuff, but it's more like vortices. Turbulence, originally you get like a kind of slight moment, and then you'll get, as the turbulence increases, you'll get vortices forming. Now, vortices are sort of, once again, sort of semi-stable structures that emerge. But unlike the matter falling through space, where that matter falling through space is kind of matter in space, vortices are distortions in the surface of the water itself. They're not like an extra element. They're actually the surface, like a wave is a part of the water itself. So with that model, you get the n-1. You don't have the atoms falling in the space. You have the stream itself, and then you have the turbulence. But it's also very much like the mosquito swarm, where you have this kind of structure that from a distance looks stable, but in fact, it's kind of constantly in motion. The vortex is constantly in motion. And this is why later on they'll say there are no points in the nomad system. There are always like vectors and movements.
Right.
It looks stable, but it's really a movement. And that's going to be their model for matter in a way. Matter is this kind of this constant movement. And if you combine that with Riemannian geometry, this kind of more advanced geometry, then you're not just talking about like a surface that's distorted, but like Einstein says that space as a whole is curved. You actually have a distortion of space in more than just the surface. The space itself becomes distorted. So that's the model they're trying to develop. It's almost like once again, the Lucretius is an analogy based on the surface of a stream of water. And they're trying to say, well, it's, space as a whole is distorted by turbulence. And that sort of turbulence, those singularities, generate these sort of structures we find around us.
They have some diagrams in the footnotes, and one of them is Michel Serre, and they show like the difference in some of the singularities that he looks at, and the kind of the shape that do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know if it's anywhere near this plateau, but they have a few diagrams in the footnotes, but they show some of those different singularities. One's like almost like a bottleneck, and one's you can almost think of like highways and things like this. I think one of them is kind of almost like we can almost see a highway interchange. And that key point, singularities, is something that we see early Deleuze resurface, and it shapes the work in a lot of ways. And I did think that it's not strictly nomad science, but it reminds me of the opposition between nomad science and raw science when you turn to Simondon and use an example that they themselves look at by arguing, for example, as Simondon does, and as Deleuze and Guattari take him up to be, there's a way in which, for example, wood can be treated in a way that doesn't respect its singularities. And you can just use a saw or a lathe and treat it as undifferentiated matter. But there's also a way, I mean, you give the example of using a wedge. I'm also thinking of one could use I forget the name of the knife, but you could kind of whittle wood in a way that would respect the knots and other singularities in the wood, the grain. And you could even go further and choose a certain tree which would have different singularities than others. In Georgia, we have all these fucking pine trees everywhere, and they would more or less be good for the sawmill, although they don't have a lot of matter compared to bigger trees, but they wouldn't necessarily be maybe as interesting to an artisan who isn't merely trying to get some logs out of it. So this is where they sort of follow Simondon and talk about already in matter, there are implicit forms, I think is the phrase that Simondon used, which is important for one of the first ways, not the only way, right? But one of the first ways that Simondon is complicating the hylomorphic model received, at least from Aristotle, who may or may not have, who knows if, we can give him credit for articulating it at least, right? Of this notion of matter as a kind of passive receptacle for form. And I think throughout the work, throughout the whole A Thousand Plateaus, they really take up this challenge against hylomorphism to a great extent, even to the point where I don't think we can understand what's going on with abstract machines, for example, which we can leave aside for now. But just as an example of, we can't really understand what's going on about these degrees of deterritorialization, et cetera, without the concern of the hylomorphic model, perhaps as a dominant image of thought.
No, absolutely. And I think, if we go back to the command and control model, then one of the claims they'll make here is that, the emergence of descriptive geometry is really important. So you have this notion in, I think, the 18th century, maybe the early 19th, where you move from a model where you'd have an architect or an engineer would say, we need this kind of structure to be built. And then the artisans who know how the material works would, create structures that fulfilled those needs. So there you have a model that's a kind of negotiation, and the communication is going in lots of different directions. Now, once you can specify form very, very precisely, you no longer have a negotiation, but you have a model, they argue, where the designer, the genius, will say, I want this, and he'll give the exact specification about what it's going to look like to someone else who then makes it. And, you lose the notion of the sort of singularities of material, but you also now have like a very clear hierarchy where someone designs and someone makes. That change is a movement away from a situation where the communication is complicated and different distinctions are being made, and to a situation where the forms of communication, the directions of communication are given in advance, and the patterning is there, and you have this kind of universalist model. You're absolutely right. It's fundamental to what they're doing, this notion of implicit form in Simondon. And here, it's the same in Simondon as well, I guess, but here it's very much at play in the politics of the war machine and then the apparatus of capture later on.
Again, Simondon kind of reminds me a little bit of the early Deleuze, where the politics seems to be part and parcel of the ontology, but it's never necessarily extremely forefront, even when looking at different societies and the collective individuation, et cetera. But I'll leave that aside just to say, he does look at the hylomorphic model lends itself to a type of social political organization where there is a master who is unfamiliar with the matter and doesn't need to be, and is giving orders, is giving like form, is supposedly active, but it's the slaves who carry out the work that actually like have the knowledge and develop it. It's a little bit Lacanian, in the sense in which it's the field of knowledge, that's the field of the slave. It's Hegelian, Lacanian. Obviously, you would be able to fill some of that in because of your work on Deleuze and Hegel, but there is explicit, very much so, in this critique of the images of thought, in noology, as Deleuze and Guattari call it, a political vector.
Absolutely. I think it's I think it runs through the whole book. One of the interesting things for me is, for instance, that the notion of the organism is such a common metaphor for the state. You see the state as this kind of organic structure, and that's key if you look at someone like Hegel. But if you look at some of the earlier chapters, like the Geology of Morals, it kind of opens the way to what goes on in the war machine, because you have this recognition that organisms are not a type that's imposed on matter, where the recalcitrance of matter just means that the form isn't properly taken up. Instead, you have this model where what becomes important is the way the singularities, when genes obviously came for proteins, and it's the sort of the singularities in the environment within which the protein is constituted lead to the structure that protein has. So suddenly you have this much richer account there. And then, when you get here, it suddenly turns out that the state too is like an organism, but it's like an organism that's a kind of Simondonian organism rather than a kind of 18th, 19th century.
With a pre-individual milieu or something like this, right?
Yeah, and there's the nomadic moment is, you can see it as a sort of state structure, but that's to just take one aspect of the assemblage. That's to see the assemblage in terms of the extensive and to cut the intensive out. And in reality, it's this kind of double process of the kind of the extensive and this kind of movement up and down that the intensive gives you through the nomadic, where structures are smoothed. Absolutely. It's all political. I think it's interesting.
One more point about minor science before I definitely want to let Coop. I know you had some brilliant points because we have talked about the passage. I'm just trying to think, because I do want to, maybe if we don't hit all of them, there's a couple of points as the axioms and the propositions develop in the Nomadology. First, what it's the exteriority of the war machine to the state is attested by mythology, and James' epic drama is attested by epistemology, which maybe not be the second one, but that's what we're talking about now. So the last point on this attestation to the epistemology, which we haven't even really delved into Archimedes and him, he's making more machines against, he's the engineer versus the state thinker or whatever. But I was thinking about how last time we got to talk to you at length about the Hegel-Deleuze opposition, if you will, or the conflict or whatever. Hegel, even Deleuze says, I probably tongue in cheek, right, where he's like, look, in recreating this history of philosophy, somebody has to be the villain. Why? Who better than Hegel? He kind of even like explicitly says this. But I was wondering about the fact that it may be, I think Hegel steals a lot of the show, a lot of the limelight from someone like Descartes. I do think that Deleuze, Descartes, you can also draw out a number of strong oppositions. And even that's how the image of thought chapter begins and spends a lot of time looking at Descartes' notion. I think, therefore, I am, thinking as being this kind of thing that everyone knows what it means. So he's kind of showing how if we get rid of explicit presuppositions, for example, man is rational animal or featherless biped, we still can have a lot of these implicit presuppositions, which may not always be able to be fully eliminated, right? So this is why the circle has to be very tortuous. But I was just thinking about how Descartes, and you spend some time in your chapter looking at how Descartes does seem to be a great representative of this type of state thinker. For example, in a lot of the things we've already, and perhaps like defining space in terms that we could say is striated, right? In terms of mere extension, movement becomes secondarized. It's merely kind of a displacement of bodies, a kind of gridding of space, if we can think of Cartesian coordinates. As useful as those developments are, and as useful as they can be for a certain type of thinking, it's not the whole story. So I was just kind of thinking of this Descartes-Deleuze opposition, which you replay in your chapter as Descartes versus Leibniz, right? Because there's something Leibniz finds missing in Descartes' account of, for example, something like extension to account for space.
The Descartes stuff's there in lots of places. It's also there in, numbering number and numbered number. But, Descartes ultimately conceives of matter. We talked about the logic of solid bodies briefly, this Lucretian, the sort of classical model of what Lucretius is doing, where you have atoms as sort of fixed things. Now, Descartes' model of what bodies are is essentially a body is a set of geometrical properties plus impenetrability. It's the kind of Euclidean properties plus impenetrability. Now, that means that Descartes really rules out any account of motion. You can have things moving, but you can have things only moving in terms of them being displaced from here to here to here
right.
to here. But he doesn't have an account of, like Leibniz shows, for instance, he doesn't have an account, or he can't give an account potentially of something like momentum. How do things actually move? This is kind of one of the key claims that's going to run through the difference between the smooth and the striated. Is, in the striated, you find behind the stuff, this is what Descartes' claim is, right? Well, we look at all this stuff around us, it's all very confusing, but there are clear and distinct ideas there. And what are the clear and distinct ideas that kind of capture the real reality, the real structure of things? Well, it's these kind of geometrical properties. And the rest, once again, is noise. Color is noise, sound. These are just kind of inessential aspects. So behind things, we find structure. And because we find structure as kind of given atemporal structure, we're unable to really account for variation. And that's a much more complicated argument to be given there. But for Leibniz, instead, the essence of matter really is force. I actually think that the places where this is most interestingly expressed in these plateaus, and this plateau and elsewhere, is the stuff on navigation, Eskimo navigation. Because, Deleuze and Guattari say, think about navigation. How do we navigate? Well, Western sailors, for instance, look up at the stars and they sort of see these field of things that are kind of fixed in place, and they use them as points for navigation. Now, the Eskimos kind of exist in the sources they use in this world where it's sort of seemingly there are no fixed landmarks. Everything's in motion. It's always snowy. They navigate by a sort of a feel of the forces that constitute that landscape. The wind, etc., the sort of changes in intensity, tracks and all this stuff that's going on that we're simply unable to see because we see things in terms of form. So there's this kind of idea that underlying matter is this kind of structure of forces that's constituting things, intensive forces. And that's really the key opposition. Descartes is one of the central thinkers of form. Leibniz gives an account where form is subordinated to force. But the irony, of course, is that the early sailors, when they sailed across the Atlantic to you guys in the New World, then they didn't really navigate by the stars all the time because it was really cloudy in the Atlantic, right?
Okay.
So, they were using these same kinds of techniques whereby, they would be sort of seeing what the wind was blowing, and they'd be sort of seeing what kinds of waves were present. All of those kind of constitutive, intensive processes going on around them, they would be using those too, because you can't see these kind of atemporal field of stuff that's supposed to be organizing your world. So in the nomadic, obviously, then is associated with movement. And that's why they say that, they follow Virilio in saying that at the heart of the nomadic is the prey. You've got the chase, you've got the hunter and the hunted, but the hunter just wants to stop. He wants to kill the thing and stop.
Yeah.
And he wants the movement to stop. Whereas the prey, I suppose in reality the prey wants to stop too, but the prey is all about movement, and the continual movement. and that process. And so there's this connection between the nomad and the weapon and movement and underlying intensity, and a recognition that there are constitutive processes underlying the world. Once again, it's just like the mosquito swarm. The swarm appears to be stable, but there are these constitutive processes underlying that apparent stability. And in reality, it's a quasi-stable object.
Coop, I was gonna recede the floor. I know I can.
No,
I can
go ahead. Just keep moving.
Keep moving. All right. Well, yeah. Be a little nomadic. I did like how you started the chapter, which makes sense. I guess we could talk a little bit about it, right? As I mentioned, they start with mythology, which I suppose makes sense if we're going to, so to speak, go back to origins, quote unquote. And Dumézil is a fascinating thinker and writer. Not all of his work, and he was prolific as well, not all of his work has been translated, but some of the books have been, and a few of them are done by Zone Books, who have a pretty nice library, and it's not too expensive. I remember reading one of the works they cite. It's not the only work, but it's one of the works they cite, the Mitra Varuna volume, and these stories about sovereignty. And one of the things that I thought was interesting thinking back on this was how the bond and the contract, right? It reminded me a little bit of throughout the book, we can see these dualities work out, and then they obviously mix and they multiply, but it reminded me a little bit of the double pincer movement, right? God is a lobster from the third plateau, but this notion of the state, and there's a third, right? Because the state, if we have Mitra Varuna or Romulus Numa on one side, the other binding and distributing, there is that third figure, the exterior of the war machine, whether it be, I can't remember if it's in Norse, if it's Tyr or some other god. No, I think Tyr might be one of the binders. There is this god of war, so to speak, who breaks up the duality. But when Norse, you have Odin, and maybe it's Odin and Tyr, and then there's a third one. Odin, he would be one of the organizers. And then in any case, it shows I gotta reread my Norse mythology. That's embarrassing. I guess I wanted to give you a chance to maybe talk a little bit about how the chapter begins, a little bit about what they find important in this double pincer movement of Mitra Varuna, Romulus Numa.
The movement itself, it comes from, as you say, Dumézil brings it in, and you have these two moments. The state's founded with these two moments, and it's repeated in all sorts of myths, and you find it in the Roman myth in terms of Romulus and Numa, or you find it in Mitra and Varuna in the, gosh, is that an Indian myth? I can't remember now. But
I believe so. Because is it Indra the third that breaks it up?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
So I think you have these two gods, and one is a kind of trickster god or a magician who binds, and one is a god of contracts. So these two moments, these two gods, and they're sort of seen as oppositional principles. You've got the kind of the magic binding, and then you've got the contract. But Dumézil and Deleuze-Guattari follow him here, sees these as kind of dual gods that together give the foundation of the state. But I think this is really key to, a great deal of what goes on here. I mean, the central idea I think that they come up with is, if you think about the pre-state society, then as Clastres talks about it, you don't have a notion of work in pre-state society. Right. They talk about there being kind of melodic conception of action, where people just do things, and they do things in a way that's not tied to work. Now, what happens in the state is you have this first moment, which is the moment of binding. And the first moment of binding is, in a sense, the movement where you move from this model where actions are, I suppose, understood as, in a sense, processes. Once again, people act in terms of what's underlying what people do. What is this kind of continuing process that's holding things together? And it becomes bound in the state into the notion of work. Now, work is the idea that you can kind of individuate what someone does, and you can separate what they do from the worker themselves. That in itself is kind of odd. It's not exploitation as such, because it doesn't mean you're taking anything away from the workers. But suddenly the notion of what it is to act has changed. And it used to be that action was an inherent part of the individual. Now there's this separation between the doer and the deed, very Nietzschean in a way. Second moment is where you then have, through the contracts, the introduction of differences and hierarchy. And the kind of claim they're making, and I think this is the point where they kind of break with Marx, really, is that there are two moments. One is the constitution of labor, and then you have the constitution of surplus labor. All societies aren't understood according to their means of production, because these kind of clusterist societies simply don't operate in terms of categories of labor. That's not what's going on. They're not productive. People act in terms of this kind of melodic conception. And then what happens is at some point they get bound in some way. And then when they're bound and you have this new notion of labor, suddenly the possibility for surplus emerges. They do go back to Marx for this in the apparatus of capture, and they say, that people in a sense begin by owning their land. They're there on the land, it's their land. And at some point, someone comes along and says, we're going to give you infrastructure, do all of these things, it's going to be great. And rather than owning the land, they then become people who just happen to be on the land at that moment. And suddenly the surplus, when there was one, which maybe the chief would go and distribute, it would have no inherent value, becomes something that can be taken off and used for building the pyramids in that kind of process model. So this is really key to the formation of the state, is this movement between Varuna and Mitra, between binding and then the surplus. And I think it's related to what in Difference and Repetition is the relation between common sense, which is the constitution of the subject, and then good sense, which is the organization of it. And so similarly, these two moments are in play. And I think this is really key in a sense. Once you have things bound, you're operating in terms of an extensive multiplicity. But what governs the nomadic is that it's operating in terms of intensity. And in a sense, the two kind of, in a sense, miss each other for that reason. They're not connected up. And as you say, there's a third moment, which is the military, Indra, the gods, and this other figure who is the nomadic, who sort of stands outside the state. And they make this very strong claim that early states don't make war. They might have a police force. They don't kind of actually make war. And that they only make war once that kind of nomadic moment is somehow incorporated into the state later on. But it's always kind of outside. It's always kind of incorporated, but can't be properly captured. That makes sense. I think that's what's going on there.
I think that they even turned to Virilio again for this point about, as you said, the state may have its forms of policing, but they don't necessarily, the war machine itself is not intrinsic from the get-go to the state apparatus, right? That's its exteriority. And so it makes sense, some of what we've discussed, that I think is it Plateau 5 where they first maybe introduce the numbering number, but they don't unpack it until this, or they don't unpack it. It's still one of those interesting concepts, but they don't unpack it as much until this chapter. But there they identify it with what they call the counter signifying regime, right? Mm-hmm. It's counter signifying because the signifier is identified with the despotic regime, with the state, with its use of language and writing and whatnot. So the counter signifying regime is associated with these movements that we're talking about, the nomad, the numbering number, and against these bindings and distributions. I suppose what it was interesting, and this maybe sets you up, Coop, was they turned to Kristeva, right, to discuss the numbering number. And I guess I'm still not sure if that's her phrasing or that they take from her the concept itself of numbering number, but she at least gives them the intuition of this non-metric multiplicity, right? Which we've been calling, whether it be intensive multiplicity or something like this. And you very nicely kind of differentiate between cardinal numbers 1, 2, 3, 4 and ordinal numbers 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and how there is a kind of non-metric intensive aspect to it, right? The difference between 1st and 3rd is not the same difference between 2nd and 4th, et cetera, right? We can kind of grasp that is not necessarily a means of pure counting and metricity.
That's right. And I think the first time I could find the term is in Deleuze's essay Bergson's concept of difference.
That's right. Yeah. Tell us about that.
He uses it there. It goes back to this notion in Bergson which is in William James as well, actually. So it's got like a long history where Bergson talks about, you look at something, I've got my yellow watch. Now, yellow is a stable color, but he says, well, when I perceive that yellow, then what I'm actually perceiving is like the wavelength event, this whole series of bumpity, 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 bump as light hits it and is reflected off into my eye. And he kind of says, well, it looks like a stable color, but what I'm actually seeing is this massive number of events, just kind of like as the frequency, it kind of is constantly, as the light has a certain frequency. So, there's a kind of rhythmic encounter between the waves of light and my optical system. So what appears to be a stable property is in fact made up of this massive number of events going on. It's like this whole series of events going on very, very quickly. Obviously for Bergson, that's kind of prior to the kind of structures, the sort of stable structures we find in the world around us. It's very, very similar to the case of the vortices, right?
Yeah.
A vortex, you think it's stable, but in fact it's caused by all of these particles going round and round and round really quickly. So that's the concept Bergson comes up with. It's numbering number is this intensive flux that generates stable structures. So that's going on, and it's a kind of non-metric notion for Bergson. But there's also this kind of Spinozist conception as well. It's very similar, numbering number, numbered number, naturing nature, natured nature. In Spinoza, where you have the two ways of understanding God. You can understand God as this explosive substance that's kind of going, pushing all this stuff out. Or you can understand the world as this kind of constituted system. So you can understand it as this kind of process of constitution or constituted. Those are the two axes that are going on in numbering number and numbered number. There are two different ways of seeing things. And it goes back to, these are the two ways of seeing what an assemblage is, really, right? You can either see an assemblage in terms of the fact that an assemblage constitutes certain systems, and you can push that process of constitution to an idealized form at the end. This never really happens, but you can sort of say, for instance, that the assemblage of language constitutes language as a stable system. It's never really stable, but you can push it that way. And then you have kind of numbered number, or else you can see this intensive process where, as we talk, language is constantly being territorialized and deterritorialized. And, like you look at...
It's being put in variation.
Yeah. And, like Black Americans come over with slavery, and they take language and they do different things with it. And they sort of use the sounds in a different way, which kind of brings it back into this kind of intensive field. And then it becomes something very different. And that leads to, blues and jazz and those structures. There's that other sense in which, therefore, you focus on the constitution, and the stable structure just becomes like a byproduct of these processes, or right. You focus on the structure, and then the constitution becomes, just an arbitrary fact.
And this again has a political element as they develop throughout the plateaus, right? Because it is a difference between the perspective of a major mode, a standardized mode, standard Queen's English, we could even say, right? That's one way of standardizing, but the mode of the state, which presupposes a kind of, as you're saying, the stability, these forms, versus language in flux and variation and becoming, which is minoritarian. And there's constantly a kind of struggle. I mean, I'm just thinking about even whether it be in Quebec and the struggle for maintaining French in a sea of English, or even in France, and proposing French terms for a lot of terms that were just borrowed in from English. Like, I remember one of the terms that always struck me was like, this not very used, complicated French term for bulldozer, instead of just like using this English term. So there's this way in which, we can imagine different languages with their authorities, with their French academies, or, as I said, Queen's English, whoever is presiding over that, the Oxford English Dictionary, right? Trying to like impose these forms for what is accepted and appropriate. And And that's why I think Geometries says something, and they say it again in A Thousand Plateaus, where the S in Chomsky, which is supposed to stand for sentence or whatever, is a power marker right before a grammar marker. Right? It's about the proper quote unquote ways of using language, the official approved uses of language, and they have a lot of other things involved with this where you're not supposed to be ignorant of the laws of grammaticality lest you be institutionalized, right? And be corrected and all of this has these political undertones, and so no, that's good.
I think in the UK we've got comprehensive schools, the sort of state schools, and then there are private schools. But we've also got schools called grammar schools, which are kind of state schools, but for selective, and you're selected if you're intelligent enough. You go to these schools, and obviously the notion of grammar school fits in, or the name even fits in perfectly with what they're talking about, because what these schools teach is the ability to, they teach more than grammar, but grammar is really important because grammar allows you to, for Deleuze and Guattari, to see who has the right to speak in the state. Right. Like who speaks grammatically, who has the right to speak. They make that claim about Chomsky as well. There's competence, whether you can use a language, and then there's performance, how you actually do, using a long sentence, you get the words wrong. But then there's a kind of social performance,
right,
or social competence rather, which is about knowing when you're allowed to talk,
right,
and then when you can't talk. And that comes through, as you say, right in the grammatical structure of a language. If you're posh and you sort of speak in a vernacular way, then you're sort of showing that you can get down with the people. Whereas
right,
if you're poor and you speak in a vernacular way, it's because you're ill-educated. The rules are very different about when you speak grammatically and when you don't, and all of these things are very important and are missed out when you see language in terms of this ideal point.
Yeah, one of my microfascisms that I'm sure probably peeves Coop, I just imagine, is I always point out some sort of like spelling, grammar error, typo. I can be a real grammar Nazi, a real a stickler on that, and so I have to be wary, be mindful of not becoming enamored with that little power tick of trying to correct people's use of language.
Absolutely, yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because we do exist in states, so we're kind of brought up with this stuff.
It's just one of those things. It's almost become a running joke at this point, I think, between us. And I know that in the refrain plateau, they go more into this difference between cadence and rhythm, but it does seem to reproduce some of the stuff we've been talking about, of the difference between metric space and non-metric space, or even metric time, and what Bergson might call durée, right, which is qualitative rather than quantitative. And they refer to, I don't think that, and Coop, remind me, because we've talked about this before, right? I don't know if is it in the footnote or is this Masumi adding, I think Masumi adds in brackets in the Kristeva footnote that we just talked about. He adds in brackets the reference to Frank Herbert. Am I remembering this correctly?
I think they directly, if I'm not mistaken.
They talk about walking without rhythm, but
because they quote the passage from Children of Dune. See, he moved with the random walk which made only those sounds natural to the desert. Nothing in his passage would indicate the human flesh moved there. It was a way of walking so deeply conditioned in him, he didn't need to think about it. The feet moved of themselves, no measurable rhythm to their pacing. In the war machine and nomadic existence, the number is no longer numbered, but becomes a cipher, and it is in this capacity that it constitutes the esprit de corps and invents the secret and its outgrowths: strategy, espionage, war ruses, ambush, diplomacy, etc.
No, this is good. This is where they bring up Dune, and again, but it's in the footnote. I was wondering if they actually cite Herbert.
I did pull that.
Yeah, look at the footnote. Just Henry, you might find it first, but
yeah, I've got it here. It looks like it's a direct citation.
No, okay, it is a direct citation.
Yeah,
and then they bring up Kristeva. So I suppose that was, I know that's one of the things that you and I have talked about, Coop, because I tried to understand the numbered number and the numbering number from the very first book of Dune, where, it seems as though the Harkonnens and even maybe the Empire and the Atreides family, they send out Duncan Idaho to go throughout the Sieches and meet the Fremen, and to literally count them and see, because there are these rumors about how many there are or aren't. And Duncan comes back and is like, it's a lot more than we think. And there's this kind of sense in which if we could just number them in a traditional standard metric way, then we could prepare appropriate force to meet them head on, even if their tactics would be much more probably guerrilla warfare, as we find out. And they are superior in every way, even if Frank Herbert may not go into great detail about that, except for knowing maybe how to maneuver in their own desert planet, which makes sense, and how to harness the Shai-Hulud, the worms. No questions here. I just wanted to bring it up because it helped me to understand numbering number and the concern, the anxiety on the behalf of the state and on the Harkonnens, not being able to number the Fremen and thereby underestimating them, because they are hedging their bets that, it's really not as big as they say. And the fact that the multiplicity of Fremen remains a little bit mysterious and is itself a kind of weapon and force, or an advantage at least.
Henry, it is interesting. So like, I've been obsessed with these connections with Dune and both Anti-Oedipus and obviously A Thousand Plateaus, just because I think, for one, it's kind of this interesting kind of ethnography of the way that these concepts can sort of be thought about, not only like this number aspect, but also in the sense of the way that Paul Atreides is this sort of exiled noble, and he almost kind of like a figure which you bring up in the chapter, Moses, right? He's kind of this sort of outsider that brings this hierarchical, like he's the one that appropriates the war machine of this sort of nomadic tribe that is undifferentiated, or at least they lack as striated, let's say, a social organism or something like that. And the way that they do it is through mythology. Almost to go back to the example of the way chess functions, like that would be a good analogy here, I think, in terms of they've been seeded with these predetermined, I don't know what you would say, like maybe the chess pieces would sort of be like an avatar, like a character, a role for them to play. So they've been pre-fed these roles, so that when Paul Atreides, the outsider, does come, he's immediately recognized as this figure that will become really their sort of messianic figure. And then he appropriates them and draws them into this sort of imperial situation. And then, it just spirals out of control there, and things go very badly once they do get appropriated into the actual state of the empire.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I really love Dune, and I think I read somewhat differently. I read Asimov's Foundation series,
right?
And they struck me as kind of like the anti-Dune in a way, because there's, you have these figures and they're predicting what's going to happen by kind of these linear means,
Right.
thousands of years. And there's this kind of sense in which you can just extrapolate from where we are to the future. I think Dune does capture this sense in which, all of this stuff is constituted from, even when they're using the thumpers and, and that sense, and the walking without rhythm, this sense that the landscape and the world is the sort of the surface of this kind of interplay of forces and things that are not there. And similarly, the notion of numbering, as you say, it's like the Fremen are this kind of these figures who, it doesn't even really matter. The number of them doesn't matter until they're brought into that structure. I think do more on this.
Yeah, I really would like to write a book about these sort of connections. I think it's super interesting. I mean, even just the desert as a smooth space versus the city, and this is a little bit veering off topic a bit, but I think it's just an interesting point relative to the walking without rhythm, as like its relationship to chaos, in the sense of like there's no rhythm to it, but it's still a type of order in a sense, if that follows, which I think is quite fascinating.
It's the discord and accord, right, of the faculties, right, that Deleuze talks about. It's that what crown anarchy or something like this, to go back to some difference of repetition terms.
Or it's like there's something signifying almost, perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe that would, I don't know. Maybe I'm getting out of my depth there, but because there is something is happening, but it's not really I guess then again, it is sort of representing the natural milieu of the desert and try to mimicking that and aligning with the sort of the natural milieu. Maybe that breaks down, but
I mean, and that's one of the figures they bring up when they discuss Kenneth White and race and this notion of the nomad and the milieu, right? And that there are dangers that are going on here, but this is go back to the minoritarian where they say in terms of in terms of race, there is no superior race. Race is minoritarian. It is always in opposition, conjunction to oppression and to dominance, a dominant system. And so I think that too can play into Dune a little bit, right? Because there is this sense in which the Fremen are the ones who are, no matter what happens, whether it be the Atreides or the Harkonnens, at least at the start, it's like that's just a new master.
Right.
Their wants and needs are sort of always left out of the equation.
Yeah, secondary to the extractive economics of the empire, really. Yeah. They're sort of viewed as these primitive, savage people that really don't matter and
Right.
are, can be killed and so forth without recompense.
I think another theme that might come out here is that, I mean, they just want everyone to leave Arrakis, right? And I think that brings out something that's really key to the war machine, which is that for states, the war machine is all about war. States appropriate it. States operate in terms of constituted structures, and they relate to other structures. And so war is really fundamental. But for the nomadic war machine in its kind of natural state, in its ideal state would be a better way of putting it, war is, I mean, it fights against states, but it only fights against states because it wants to smooth space. It's not inherently tied to war. It's just that in trying to smooth spaces, it naturally comes into conflict with the forces of striation that have striated those structures. So there's something very interesting there that I think you kind of see in Dune, that the war machine implies war, but it's not an essential component of what the war machine is. They enter into this conflict, but it's always secondary to the real goal, which is just simply to make these spaces smooth. Like, in all these situations, when you mess around with grammar, you just want to create new variations within language, but then you invariably find yourself dealing with power structures where if people speak in schools like they did in the 1950s, in Black American English vernacular, whereas in fact they were just playing with a variation in language. So there's a natural movement whereby the war machine encounters striated space and then it becomes conflict. But inherent to it is simply this desire to smooth spaces.
This reminds me of two things, and we can continue just a little bit of the Dune stuff. One, I think it was Eugene Holland who, I could be wrong, and maybe I'm thinking of another guest we had on, who proposed thinking of war machines as metamorphic machines, insofar as war machines do not inherently take war as its object. That's only when they've been appropriated, as you were saying, Henry. But the second thing would be, it's interesting how Deleuze and Guattari is always want to caution in letting us think that smooth means good, striated means bad, because they do intimate, especially after the Second World War, where we have what they talk about, and they don't go too much into this in this plateau. They may delve a little bit more in the 13th in Apparatus of Capture, which, as you said, forms a series, forms a block, but they do talk about the worldwide war machine, which, in its fascist variations we've obviously seen and they go into, but they also intimate the post-fascist worldwide war machine that is trying to smooth spaces out in spite of, but also in league with the state apparatus. And so we can't just think that smooth is purely on the side of some sort of eternal good. We have to be a little bit careful. And as always, we're going to find these mixtures, but the mixtures become more complicated once we get to this global era made possible by technology, etc., and advances in warfare, the information age, the digital age, blah, blah, blah.
When you move from states to the global system of capitalism as the primary structure, then the war machine becomes problematic. And it's problematic, I think, because they talk about it in terms of non-denumerable sets, and right, which means that it essentially can't be captured within the logic of the state, but yet is still kind of like still harnessed by that state. So there's this sense in which the war machine, or these possibilities for radical transformation, become just very negatively determined. They uncontrollable forces or potentially uncontrollable forces because the state harnesses them, but yet at the same time is unable to fully understand what they are. The apparatus of capture is where they really go into that, and they draw out that result from the analysis in terms of set theory. So set theory becomes the model of form in that plateau. We've talked about form in terms of Descartes and in terms of Lucretius, but there it becomes this kind of set theoretical model. That's where you presuppose form, and it's unable to account for these other processes. And they talk a lot about Blanchet's.
Yeah, the axiomatics.
Really interesting stuff.
I was just thinking about how, Coop, this notion of the worldwide war machine, it made me think about what you were intimating with. It's when the Fremen get harnessed and appropriated and then unleashed on the galaxy or the galaxies.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
That innumerable deaths, trillions or whatever. I'm not sure. You would have to tell me, but it seems like that's the aftermath of this post-fascist, peace through terror type of situation that Deleuze and Guattari are talking about.
It's something like 60 billion, I think, or something like that. I think also to maybe segue a little bit, because this, I think, goes hand in hand, so to speak, would be Henry discusses the metallurgy and, I guess, aspect. And I think it is interesting, like the way that, I don't know, these tools of war, especially drawing from something like the peasantry during, I don't know, it's like the Edo period in Japan, where you have the development of the farm implements get mobilized into the war effort against the nobility. The bow staff, like, so a shepherd's staff becomes a weapon, something like, not a scythe, but like a pitchfork becomes a scythe.
The kukri or whatever.
Yeah.
Or, well, that's a scythe, but I'm not sure.
Nunchucks would be maybe the, I forget what the implement would be, but I believe it is really developed out of some type of farm tools. I mean, if you want to draw an analogy for the Fremen, it would be the use of the worm tooth as their blade. I don't know. There's something kind of interesting there with regard to, I don't know, milieu. I don't know if that's necessarily getting, maybe machinic phyla, we could stash that to the side, but I don't know. There's some type of element I can't really grasp what I'm sort of getting at as far as like the development, the way that these tools get reappropriated or metamorphized into something. I don't know if you can help me out with that at all, Taylor.
And it also seems to pinpoint the blacksmith being sort of set apart from the nomads and the state, and having truck with both of them in their itineracy, right? Because Henry, we've talked a little bit about the sedentary, which would be the state, and the nomad, but Deleuze and Guattari not just show how those are mixed, but complicate, or at least name some of the mixtures we get, which is the itineracy of the Smiths versus the transhumance of these seasonal farming groups versus migrants. But we can at least talk about the itineracy of metallurgists who are following the flows of matter, which I think is what, Coop, they would think about in terms of the phylum.
Okay, cool.
In the next plateau, you have this whole account of how in the East, you have these tradespeople develop in terms of, you have these big mega machine societies, these hydraulic societies, and they're sort of building all these great things. So you have the emergence of like these crafts like metallurgy, but people have very limited lives. They're not respected in these communities. And then in the West, you have, in places like Greece, you have a lot less organized societies, but they're kind of freer. And what happens is you have this migration of these metallurgical figures, these figures from the East to the West, and they bring with them these skills. And they form this strange position, because the communities in the West are not big enough to support a metallurgist, someone who can make tools. They're just too small to support these extra people. So you have these people moving between communities who are making tools for these communities, and they occupy this position that's very, very ambiguous. They're not part of the state, but yet they're in the orbit of the state, and they're kind of, in a sense, reliant on it. And I think, they talk about the mark of Cain. They've got this mark.
Yeah.
So, because they need to be recognized. They move between these different places. You need to know that it's not like some enemy come to kill you. It's the metallurgist doing his rounds. And I think on the one hand, this is a really interesting point, a structure that But you also find in the state, in a bigger sense, maybe, if you think about the school of bridges and roads that Anquarian talks about, this kind of 18th century organization of engineers that built the infrastructure in France. Similarly, they had this kind of, they weren't in the state, but because they had their own structures of organization and their own independence, but they were kind of in the orbit of the state. So they have this strange position historically where they're kind of not in either of those moments. And we can say other things, that they're focused on problems. They make things, they fix things. And particularly the metallurgist is interested in the characteristics of matter, the singularities of matter. And I think if you think about an assemblage, an assemblage is where, matter's got these singularities, and then a set of those singularities is selected out, and they become organized and territorialized. They get given a certain structure that allows them then to take on a function. They say there's a tetravalence to the assemblage. On the one hand, it's got the function, and there's the Helms-Levian stuff about function and content and expression. And on the other, there's this moment of intensity where they're kind of, the singularities are taken up and constituted, and that they can, the flexibility of the assemblage comes from the fact that we can move back down and deterritorialize these things. It seems like if you think about smooth and striated spaces as being ways of understanding assemblages, then the metallurgist is more like a figure who is able to kind of constitute assemblages in the first place, something like this. And I'm not, I'm kind of on quite loose ground here, but that seems to be what's going on. There's this extra space, which is the holy space with holes, not and it's that, and that's this kind of space that the metallurgist occupies, where you have this kind of flow of stuff, and the metallurgist kind of selects out bits in order to constitute assemblages. It makes holes, like literally, kind of this flow of matter, takes out materials, and makes alloys and metals and all these things that then lead to assemblages, etc., etc. So the holy space is this kind of space of cutting away from the machinic phylum, this field of singularities, in order to make assemblages possible. I think that's what's going on. I mean, it's a bit obscure, some of this stuff. I mean, does that sound right to you guys?
What I thought was interesting, because this notion of the smith is sort of not on the inside or the outside, right? I think that's part of the holy space, right? It's the intermezzo, right? It's the in between, and that's what constitutes the itineracy, is sort of following the flows of matter, which I thought was interesting for me, because in Anti-Oedipus, they seem to identify the nomad with following the flows. And so you can see how certain embryonic conceptions burgeon and develop and multiply and become a little bit more complicated as they not only think a little bit more about these and focus a little bit more on them, but also the footnotes don't even do like half the justice of showing how much research they do. I mean, I don't know if you would call Deleuze and Guattari's work scholarly works, but if you look at Capitalism and Schizophrenia, I mean, obviously in all of their works, but if you look specifically at these works, you can see the immense amount of material, and it's interdisciplinary in a very straightforward sense. You can see how much more they are really trying to go to these sources. Some are authorities in a field, some are disparate thinkers, minor lines of thinkers like Kleist, like Artaud, who get brought up in, like Desargues, another kind of semi-forgotten alternative to Cartesian geometry, right? Like they're not only like mining, I guess that's a good word, they're not only mining the scholarly fields, they're also sort of forging these new lineages, if you will. They're doing a little metallurgy themselves by, I don't want to say new lineage, but it's a minor line that's interesting to them. I love the Artaud-Rivière dispute that I think Deleuze had already, isn't it a different sort of petition where he already kind of discusses this a little bit, where Artaud is trying to get these poems published and he's getting this feedback that's just like, look, if you could just put a little bit of form into it, if you just work a little bit harder, and you'll get there, you'll be a good poet. Riviere is completely misunderstanding what Artaud is after. And so it is similar to a lot of these discussions that we're talking about, where there is this notion of an imposition of a certain respected, standardized major mode and form onto these minor, in order to kind of suffocate or strangle out the semiotic asperities, as Guattari might call them, and to fit this preconceived notion of a good form. I don't know how that relates to metallurgy, but I'm trying to maybe articulate just some of the question of itineracy being much more for them defined in terms of falling flows, whereas nomads seems to be like in touch with a relation to the earth and this deterritorialization that doesn't necessarily have to be in motion, as you intimated earlier. But this figure of Artaud is great. I know you said you had wanted to talk a little bit about Kleist, and you bring up Desargues too in your chapter. I didn't know if you wanted to hit on any of that.
I think what's going on here is that in this text is that the nomad and the sort of sedentary thinker are both operating in terms of the assemblage, and that seems to be really, really key. And the metallurgist has this kind of odd role as somehow he's not on the border between the two. That's the interesting thing, is that although the metallurgist is kind of outside of both worlds, he's not like a mix in a sense, but is something different from both, but yet related to both. And I think that's kind of what's kind of makes him difficult to understand, or him or her. I mean, I suppose they tend to be male itinerant metallurgists, I imagine. But because if we go back to the desert being smooth and the city being striated, then like in a sense, Deleuze and Guattari will say, well, no, that's not true. You can go to the desert and you can just sort of wander around and not really understand what's going on and see it as a bunch of stuff. And I think if you've ever been to like a neighborhood in a city, if you know a city, then there are those that you walk through parts of the city maybe a bit later at night, and you can sense the mood of the area you're in, and you have that kind of feeling that you need to keep an eye out for stuff, which is not given by the structures present. It's given by some kind of presentiment of something kind of like underlying forces. And similarly, if you think about the street children in Bogota as examples of a kind of nomadic people, they occupy the city in a smooth way. The smooth and the striated in an odd way are both ways of understanding the same things. There's two different ways of understanding the assemblage. And the question is whether you see the assemblage as a system in continuous variation, or you see it as a matter of constants and variables. And the metallurgy seems to just fall outside of that. But I don't have I don't have a great notion of what the metallurgist is doing.
To circle back, there was something, Coop, that you brought up that I thought was fascinating, where this repurposing of tools into weapons, and also being a part of the Machinic phylum and the development of weapons. And they give, I think, Henry, you said you went through 5 of the distinctions between tools and weapons. But there is a sense in which any tool can be a weapon if you use it right. But this is why they speak a little bit more loosely in terms of these approximations. And it does seem interesting, these differentiations, but also a little bit of continuity between the two, and how even in terms of strife, I don't know if you were talking about the French Revolution, but you were talking about some, maybe earlier, but you were quoting, I think, some 17th century, maybe English historian, talking about even the women and children coming out with, shovels and sticks and whatnot. Again, tools can do this repurposing, but it does seem interesting how there is a sense in which the evolution of weaponry and warfare is tied into this discussion of assemblages that we're talking about, where one of the simplest assemblages they talk about, which is related to a milieu of the steppes, where they talk about man, horse, bow. It's a fairly simple assemblage to grasp and useful just to articulate it's the harnessing, and obviously there would be particular developments along the way that would help to make this simple assemblage into something of an effective horsebow unit, like the development of the stirrup, like the shaping of bows from hunting to something more mobile and compact, composite bows, etc. There's this whole interesting historical development that can be seen in the perfecting of the assemblage.
I think they try and tread a line between, on the one hand, they want to recognize that tools can be really important. Like the stirrup is the key example, right? The stirrup transforms the horseman because they, instead of, having to use their hand, they can incorporate the weight and the force of the horse into the strike. So the stirrup, because they sit firmly on the horse, changes all of that. It also kind of operates within, you need a whole system,
a social system
to make that work, right?
Yeah.
You need feudalism.
Like feudalism. Yeah, right. Okay.
Without the feudal system, you don't have the resources channeled so that, a man can have a horse and a full set of armor and then like another horse in case that horse gets killed on the battlefield. It needs a replacement.
And a page and whatever it is that, an entourage, right?
And you start getting love poetry that's about great deeds done on the battlefield, because now you can move fast, so the initiative of the individual knight becomes important. Notions of chivalry become important. So all of these structures are kind of interplaying in this really complex way, and it sort of changes everything. So absolutely, I mean, it's tools, but Coop, like you were saying, it's the nunchucks, I think, were used for beating grain. The tools were kind of like had a purpose, and then in a different assemblage they become something very, very different. It's this kind of weird thing where singularities are taken up, selected, but they have to be selected within a whole system in order to become an assemblage. Yeah, absolutely. It's like the book where the stirrup example comes from is about the way in which technology shapes society, and I think that they want to have a more balanced view where the tool itself is a product of the assemblage. The tool and its function is a product of the assemblage, rather than it being the ground.
I thought that was interesting, the discussion of, with these different assemblages, they come part and parcel of these, of these societal assemblages. So there's a whole ripple effect. And it reminds me of one of Deleuze's seminars. It was one of the first translated and up on Web Deleuze. Now I forget the title, but it was about multiplicities, and Deleuze is fascinated by this sort of ancient Chinese manual that treats in the same language, in the same breath, love and war. And he's fascinated with the societal organization, the whole milieu surrounding it that allows for this discussion of love and war in the same language, in the same metaphors, in the same text. It just kind of reminded me in general about, with the evolution of this chivalric warfare, comes a whole coterie of different changes in society, including literary forms, including societal organizations, including these hierarchies, including these more complex, these support systems, if you will. As you were kind of already saying, with the blacksmith not being able to be, not these towns and villages not necessarily being able to be complex enough to support a blacksmith. The same could go for knights, right? It really takes a different organization of society, a different territorial machine, if you will.
Absolutely. And, like the free men who used to, they were free because they could supply their own sword and their own armor and go to fight. And suddenly they get disenfranchised because, you don't need them anymore. You just want them to supply a certain amount of money to support the knight. Yeah. So everything changes. Yeah. That was, it's fascinating, these movements with assemblages. The other factor here is obviously the Crusades, which then go in the opposite direction and start deterritorializing this feudal structure, which I think Guattari is very interested in. The Crusades is this other moment within the same assemblage.
In the first chapter, maybe the introduction of schizoanalytic cartographies, that's one of the anticipations of the whole book, is he's going to focus on this interesting moment in Christianity and its whole rhizomatic spiraling out in its development. And a lot of that reflection is obviously borne out in the work done in Capitalism and Schizophrenia. So it makes sense. And same with the Machinic Unconscious. He even says that it's a kind of a handbook to A Thousand Plateaus. And so we see meditations on the refrain, on faciality, on semiotics, and all that's very relevant here. Is there anything else we wanted to hit upon that obviously haven't exhausted the plateau, but was there anything else you wanted to discuss before we allow you space for your outro?
Maybe we can come back and talk some other time about
yeah
something else. I mean, there's so much here. You could just talk for hours and hours and hours about this one plateau. I think maybe we should cut it up there.
Save some meat on the bone. You mentioned 2 books that you're working on. Obviously, the book on A Thousand Plateaus, which you've said you've got at least half finished, and you've got at least. I mean, I'm not sure what stage you're in, but you mentioned a SART book. Is there anything else going on? Anything else of significance that you'd like to sort of tell us about in the near future?
Gosh, well, I think that's most of it. I know you're talking to Jeff Bell at some point soon.
Yes.
And Jeff and I are doing the Deleuzean Mind, which is a collection of kind of like 40 odd essays on Deleuze by various scholars. So that's
hopefully this isn't about the minds of Deleuzians, which would be truly horrifying, and more about Deleuze himself, correct?
I mean, it's a series. You can go and see. There's a Kierkegaardian mind and a mind and a whole series of other ones. So no, I mean it's an unusual choice for a title, but that's going on too at the moment, which is great actually, because we're reading tons of stuff about bits of Deleuze and Guattari and stuff that you wouldn't normally read, just because you can read everything. So
yeah.
So that's coming out too. But aside from that, I mean, to be honest, I'm just getting really obsessive about working through A Thousand Plateaus at the moment. I'm really just trying to spend all of my time figuring out what's going on.
They call it like a rhizome book or something like this. So, you don't have a beginning or end, and that's frightening too. So, hopefully you'll burrow your way out through the middle again and be able to come out with this. And we'd love to have you back I think I had mentioned that I find, everybody has their favorite plateau, and they even say it's like a record you can listen to. You might have your favorite tracks, and one of mine is the postulates of linguistics. I think the way it's written is interesting because it really does showcase some of what we talked about today, the major and minor modes, for example. Once you've gotten that polished and sent off to press, or if that's too long, we'll yoke you back in, just to do some more of this, or to talk about the Deleuzean mind, which might be a way to get you and Jeff together. But yeah, we're talking to Jeffrey in March. It might be sooner than that. I have to look at the schedule, but we are having him on probably in like a week and a half, something like that.
Yeah, it's great.
Or maybe 2 weeks.
Yeah, February 18th is when we're recording.
So yeah, we'll have Jeffrey on soon, and I know we're going to focus on his book. I forget the title off the top of my head, but it's sort of Undermining the Continental Analytic Divide. It's one of his more recent books.
An inquiry into analytic continental metaphysics. So that sounds pretty fun, actually.
I think that'll be good because we often stray on the continental side, but it's nice to try to undermine that divide and show it not to be as hard and fast. And there's easy ways to parody either, obviously. So showing continuities there and overlaps is really important. I have to thank you for getting us in touch. That was really kind of you and really great. And then you gave me another thread to follow up. I'll try to get in touch with Anne Carrion, and that would be great to bring her in because she's done work on Deleuze that is fascinating, and we'll get to see a little bit of that work. I could have talked to you more about the École and its downfall, but it reminded me a little bit about, you said it was at the French Revolution that things really start to fall apart and get overcoded, and it reminded me a little bit about the history of the École Normales. And it's these normal schools, these standardized schools that kind of are part and parcel of the outgrowth of the French Revolution. And the superior, right? The École Normale Supérieure is like this teaching of teachers how to properly teach. So there's a whole history of education in France that's fascinating that the readers will get to see in this chapter in particular, and probably in some of the other chapters in your book. And I know that would have taken a whole long detour to like contextualize, but it's nicely done in the chapter you showed us.
Oh, thank you. I've actually finished the postulates, so
yeah.
Now, so we can take a break for a while, but like,
yeah,
I'd be more than happy to come back and talk about them. I sort of felt the same as you. I wasn't particularly expecting a lot from them just before I went through, but by the end, I thought they're fantastic. There's some really fantastic work there, particularly coming after the geology of morals as well. You know, the way those two tie together, I think is really, really interesting. So
and I feel like the geology, if you read A Thousand Plateaus linearly and you get to geology, I think it's by that time in the book that you want to start putting it down. You're like, okay, that's a little bit too much strata, epistrata, peristrata, like, you know, that's a little too much Helmsleb for me, dog. You have to really like kind of power through it. It reminds me too of like difference repetition, where chapter 1, you start to get into the Aristotle stuff and you're like, I don't know, can I just skip this, come back? But yeah. Anyway, Henry, thanks for coming on the show, and I'll be sure to let you know once this episode drops, which might be in probably 2 weeks, and I'll also let you know how the interview goes with Jeff.
Yeah, well, I'm sure like Jeff and I talk a lot, so I'm sure we'll hear anyway. But
there you go. Yeah.
Thank you so much, both of you, for having me on again.
Absolutely.
Once again, I really enjoyed it. So
we got to talk shop. Got to talk. This is an entry into the Deleuzian mind, right? Where we get to talk Deleuze inside baseball.
Absolutely.
We're gonna stay on for a few more minutes just to talk about our next episode, and we'll be in touch. And it's been our pleasure.
All right. No, it's been great, guys. Thanks a lot.
Thanks again, Henry. And once again, thanks to Henry Summers Hall for joining Taylor and I on this week's edition of the Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour.
The very roots of evil, of negativity and singularity, including the ultimate form of singularity, which is unconscious, to the whole state of things, the pure violence without object anymore. This is the typical violence of information. It's violent because what happens there is a murder of the real, the vanishing point of reality.
Let's not have a misunderstanding here. What I meant is the following.
With nothing left but recycled, whitewashed, lobotomized people, as in Clockwork Orange.